measurable outcome, right? You can test whether someone can read or not read, right or not right. And within these spaces, there doesn't appear to be much space for visual education. It wasn't part of that curriculum. But there was another popular 19th century pedagogical method that emphasized the role of observation in learning, and that is the object lesson. Object lessons depended on first-hand observation as the basis for teaching and learning. And teachers were encouraged to use common objects as well as animals, such as a piece of glass, grains of rice, a feather, or even a pet cat, in order to teach students to look closely and learn through their senses. Now, the idea of the object lesson was introduced by the Swiss educator Pestalozzi in the late 18th century, and it's firmly rooted in Enlightenment ideals. One of the fundamental principles of the object lesson is that things must come before words so that students learn through their own observations and experiences. And of course, this was also promoted by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book Emile, which is also full of statements about how things must come before words. So there were a lot of educators and sort of people talking about this at the time. Now, a second important principle of the object lesson is that observation will form the basis for subsequent learning. The lessons were not intended to simply impart information, but to cultivate the faculties, which were conceived of as rungs in a ladder. So according to this approach, which was based in faculty psychology, the first step in the ladder of learning was to exercise and strengthen the faculty of perception. And there was a strong emphasis on visual observation. Object lessons were popularized in England by Charles Mayo, who spent time at Pestalozzi's school, and by his sister Elizabeth Mayo, who was involved in the formation and management of the Home and Colonial School Society and its model school. Now, Mayo wrote a number of books. She also edited a magazine for teachers. These are two of her earliest books that circulated quite widely. Lessons on Objects was first published in 1830. Lessons on Shells, first published in 1832. But they both went through numerous editions. Lessons on Objects was particularly popular, and I think the latest edition I found was from 1876. And it was something like the 26th edition. So, and these are they're quite commonly found in library collections today. In these texts, Mayo explains that the first step in the business of education, and these are her words, is to lead children to observe with attention the objects which surround them. It sounds a lot like some of the things we were doing this morning too, right? Now, Lessons on Shells, that one on the left, it included 10 plates with illustrations of shells at the end of the book. But they came with a very firm warning that the illustrations are for the teacher only and were not to be shared with students. The students must learn from the objects themselves. In Mayo's words, she said, the object itself should be presented to the children, that their knowledge be acquired by themselves, instead of all being simply communicated by the teacher. Now, the danger of this simply communicating information to pupils for Mayo was that, I have a quote over here, under such a mode of instruction, their minds remained passive, and they acquire a habit of receiving impressions from others at a time when they ought to be gaining mental power by the exertion of their own faculties. And just reading all this stuff and like this language about active and passive learning is so similar to what I hear all the time from my colleagues and, you know, in sessions on pedagogy. So this really intrigued me. Now, in order to teach through object lessons, teachers were encouraged to form their own collections of objects. And this practice was encouraged by teachers' manuals and magazines aimed at teachers. So one of my favorite finds, as I was traveling around looking at these books, I was looking at school books, but also trying to find some of the actual objects that were used in this kind of teaching. And I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, got out one of Mayo's books that was in their collection, and inside the book was a collection of feathers, which I was so excited about. So this is a copy of Model Lessons for Infant School Teachers and Nursery Governesses. This copy was owned by Catherine Brown. She inscribed it in the front. She just wrote her name and the date, which was was like October something, 1850. And then there are all these feathers kind of slotted into the book at various points. And of course what makes this even more exciting is that there is a chapter on feathers within the book. Here, I asked them to photograph this for me, and I'm kind of annoyed that they cut off the sort of title at the top, but that would say a feather. At this point in the book, there were 2 feathers inserted there, so you really get this sense that these are the actual objects that she was teaching with. So a lot of teachers were creating their own collections at this time, but educational suppliers also produce specimen boxes that can be purchased. So look at an example of that. This is an object lesson specimen box that is in the V&A's Museum of Childhood, produced around 1850. This one's quite rare. I'm not quite sure how common it was for teachers to have these. I've seen a lot of advertisements for them. This one's pretty rare that it survives intact, because as you can imagine, I mean, anyone who's spent time with children and have like Lego pieces around their house, right? Like, how did these all survive in their place? So I think this was sort of maintained in a collection and wasn't actively used. But I have found a few of these boxes intact. So I want to look a little more closely at some of the trays. This is the first tray and then our last tray. So you'll notice that on the first tray, there's a number of common objects. We have things like scissors, glass, an acorn, a key. This is one of my favorites. This is a little ladybug preserved in a box. And this stuff is really held up quite nicely. Now in the bottom tray, we have raw materials like marble, slate, and quicksilver. So it's sort of like, as you move from the first tray to the last tray, you're going from these sort of finished objects to raw materials. Now the third tray, this is my favorite tray I think, because we have raw materials side by side with finished products. There are hemp seeds, hemp fibers, and cloth, and then we have on the right, that's a cocoon of a silkworm, unwove silks, and then finished silks, and different kinds of fabrics. And you'll notice that they're all carefully labeled, and they're labeled on the object, but also on the box where they're housed. So these are really meant to be taken out and handled and compared. And then, you have that label so that you can put it back in its proper spot. You'll also notice, this is, as I've been showing you this, some of these are English materials, but we also see materials imported from around the world. And so I really think about this box as kind of like a little great exhibition in a box that you can bring into a classroom. So it is like a tool for experiential learning, what we would call experiential learning today. I think I've been talking a lot about visual observation, and I think in all these texts there's a real emphasis on using that word observation. But it really is meant to involve all of the senses. And here, tactility is incredibly important, right? Being able to actually touch these things and compare the textures. And I can say when I went into their sort of storage area and they brought this out for me, they made me wear gloves to examine this. And just that idea, like how frustrating that was, really highlighted for me just how important touch was to experiencing this specimen box. Now, object lessons were eventually included in the Code of Education in England and Wales. Beginning in the 1870s, England's educational codes began to emphasize first-hand observation and direct experience. Likely in response to concerns regarding the system of payment by results and the perception that this led to mere rote learning. So if you read sort of instructors' reports at the time, inspectors' reports, there's a lot of complaints about rote learning, and a lot of educationists are complaining about this, and so you gradually start to see some responses. Starting in 1871 in their code, there's a sort of warning, we're going to modify this so that there's more emphasis on direct observation. And then the Education Code of 1877 stipulated regarding science subjects, and this is a quote, "If these subjects are taught to children by definition and verbal description, instead of by making them exercise their own powers of observation, they will be worthless as means of education," end quote. And then with the revised code of 1882, object lessons were officially incorporated into the curriculum for optional class subjects. And then 1895, object lessons became a requirement for all students. so that this was part of the sort of basic education. Alongside these changes to the educational code, materials produced for object lessons proliferated. Here's a graph that I created all by myself, which I'm very proud of. And it just shows just a simple search that I did in WorldCat for books with object lessons in the title. So this is not sort of a comprehensive study, but just shows how many of these books have survived to the present in collections. And you can see, I mean, I'm not a statistician, but that seems like a very significant spike, right, in the 1890s. And I think we can see that this is kind of a response to the codification of object lessons in the curriculum.